So, I think the first thing is always to consider why people get into either the industry or a speciality or a topic that they really enjoy. So, Steve, do you want to start, I guess, both with what got you into the industry? Obviously, if we go back a few years now, and what got you wanting to do insulin and kind of blood sugar control as a topic on the podcast?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it's probably actually two slightly different areas for me in terms of my journey into the industry. I actually come from like more of a sports science, sports studies background. So I studied that at university. I then studied nutritional therapy kind of after that. I then worked as a PT and was doing nutritional therapy and personal training side by side for like a number of years, basically. It wasn't until probably about kind of like, I think it was like 2008, 2009, like I was starting to get some health issues myself. So as a personal trainer, I was like just really fatigued all the time, couldn't train, was getting ill really frequently, couldn't train more than 2 weeks at a time, and then I would get ill, just a few digestive symptoms, that sort of thing. And that went on for a couple of years or so. I then saw a functional medicine practitioner speak in 2010, which is when it was probably not that trendy in the UK at that time. And then I got speaking to him, and I started working with him around then. And we kind of picked up on a couple of digestive infections, done some other work. There was some adrenal kind of like dysfunction going on as well, and some sex hormone like reduced testosterone and various kind of things going on. I worked with him for about 3 to 6 months, and he was kind of showing me how he works with clients from a more functional medicine perspective. And I really kind of got the bug because for me, I spent 2 years kind of just struggling a little bit with my health and not being able to function at my absolute best and not being able to deliver what I want to deliver to my clients. So going through that process and seeing how a functional medicine practitioner works firsthand and then experiencing the benefits then kind of led me into going, okay, I started working and being mentored by him, and then I worked through various kind of like functional medicine sort of programs, FMU, IFM, like that sort of thing thereafter. In the realms of kind of glucose and insulin and that sort of thing, it's really interesting in the sense that this is an area that through the whole side of my mother's side of the family, there's this big long stream of type 2 diabetes. So a very strong kind of genetic predisposition towards type 2 diabetes. Like my mother was first diagnosed 20 years ago. She's 20 years later and still doesn't take any medication. So self-managed through nutrition, lifestyle, that sort of thing. But all of her brothers type 2 diabetic, both her parents type 2 diabetic. Like, so a really strong sort of family history. And I think because of that family history and just that interest in that area, it's just been an area that I've always found particularly interested and always wanted to try and sort of, I guess, explore some of the physiology behind it as well. Whilst there might be, and you'll know this, whilst there might be kind of genetic predisposition towards things, obviously it's our environment, it's what we do, and it's maybe physiologically what's going on in the body that's going to determine whether something like that develops. So yeah, I guess my journey into functional medicine was a little bit more personal health and digestive related, and my journey to do with more glucose and insulin management is a little bit kind of more personal from a family history point of view as well.
Nice. Yeah, I think the vast majority of us, I think, have personal health issues, don't we, that kind of drive us into to
Yeah.
just learning and wanting to then help others going through that experience.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I think sometimes the frustration of how a lot of the chronic symptoms are being dealt with, and that was certainly my case in terms of just almost hitting my head against a brick wall, trying to get to the bottom of why I was feeling so fatigued, why my digestion wasn't right, and just the usual sort of, kickback, which unfortunately we hear from a lot of our clients in terms of like, I don't want to knock doctors or anything like that because I think there are certain things that they're amazing at, and it's a lot of the time it's the ability to have time to sit down and listen to the person and create that story and that journey that we have the ability to be able to do as functional medicine practitioners. So I don't think it's an issue with the doctors per se. I think it's more to do with the system and the conditions that people are going in with, and then the methods that you're trying use to be able to treat those conditions or symptoms or whatever they are, if that makes sense.
No, complete sense, yeah. And as you say, it's a common story, and it is a time thing. I mean, obviously, it's slowly changing with nutrition entering some of the medical schools.
Yeah.
And while I don't want to sound pessimistic or negative, I do think, like you mentioned, that actually the fundamental thing that probably needs to change there is just the length of consultation time. And obviously there are vast challenges to that, and it's easier to incorporate some education, which is still critical. And clients actually have said over the last week, in sort of conversations I've had on this topic, how if they could go and see their GP who had some education around nutrition and its role in some of these chronic health conditions, even if they just have some basic handouts that they can give, so obviously keeping consultation times at a realistic time frame, that would still revolutionize the population's health probably.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's that ability to actually say to someone that there are things that you can do that you're in control of, that have the potential to improve this situation. I do also think off the back of the doctors, you need this kind of system of coaches and nutritionists or dietitians or whatever it might be, to support that doctor, but there to be a clearer avenue and pathway for that doctor to be able to get that support for that practitioner. Now, the only way that doctor is going to be able to do that is, one, if they respect nutrition and movement and sleep and all of those things, and that's only going to come with education within the sort of medical setting, I guess, which I think is developing. And I think that's the thing, because there's so much more research on nutrition and sleep and movement and all of those things now, that it's starting to become something that they are having to embrace a little bit more, which I think is a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we just open up a whole new topic for our show, on the topic of kind of insulin and blood glucose, do you want to perhaps start with giving us an overview of kind of the process? So from what we're consuming to how it influences physiology, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is a really nice place to start, because ultimately, whether we're looking at kind of issues with, people that may get highs and lows in blood sugar, or people that have chronically high blood sugar levels and therefore kind of, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, that sort of thing, we have to understand the underlying mechanisms behind why that might take place. So I think the journey of food is a really good place to start. So, I mean, ultimately, when we eat food, we start digesting it or breaking it down, chewing it. We swallow it into the digestive system. And one of the really interesting things which I've kind of come across over the last couple of years has been how the gut actually influences the management of blood sugar. And it does this even before the blood sugar levels start to elevate. So one of the things that will happen is, when we ingest food, within 2 minutes of us ingesting food, we have certain enteroendocrine cells, which are able to sense saccharides, so carbohydrates, when they enter into the digestive system. And you then have these things called incretins, and one of those is glucagon-like peptide 1, or GLP-1. So GLP-1's job is to essentially stimulate the pancreas to make insulin even before blood sugar levels have elevated, which when I first kind of learned about this, this was not anything that I've been taught about through nutrition, through my degree, and the years that followed after that. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Because what you'll actually get, and there's one study that they did where they injected either went IV with the glucose or oral with the glucose. And you get the strongest insulin response from oral glucose versus IV glucose, which is really interesting, because you're stimulating glucagon-like peptide. That stimulation of glucagon-like peptide gives, essentially what it does is the glucagon-like peptide goes to the pancreas and it's able to stimulate the release of preformed insulin. So this is insulin that's being held within the cell, ready to be released. So you get this massive dump of insulin immediately after you've ingested food.
Okay.
The joy of having that is that once glucose starts to enter into the bloodstream, once we've broken it down, obviously it goes via the liver, and then the liver kind of then starts feeding the glucose back out, and then the blood sugar levels go up. But now what we've got is this kind of already a presence of insulin already in the bloodstream that's able to start that process of distributing and allowing glucose to enter into, say, musculoskeletal, into muscle tissue. The other really interesting thing that stimulation of a high level of insulin does is that it suppresses glucagon. And glucagon is one of the hormones that basically stimulates the continuous production of insulin to make sure we have this stable level, this continuous production of glucose, to make sure we have this stable level of glucose all the way through. So the brain's always got a supply of glucose. The only challenge with that is obviously if we're continuing to produce glucagon and we've just absorbed loads of glucose into the system, we can end up with much, much higher levels of glucose than what we would actually want or desire. So what's interesting is that first phase insulin response, as is known, where we stimulate glucagon-like peptide, gives you that spike in insulin, which then suppresses glucagon and then also allows you to manage glucose as it enters into general circulation. Now, if someone has what's known as a blunted first phase insulin response, so they're not producing as much glucagon-like peptide 1, then as the blood sugar levels go up, we haven't suppressed the glucagon as we would have wanted to. So there's still a production of glucagon going on. And also we don't have this presence of glucose ready to start to bring their blood sugar levels down. So what you tend to get with people that have a blunted first phase insulin response is a much longer and slightly higher level of glucose after a meal instead, which is really interesting. Whereas with someone that has a good first phase insulin response, their peak of blood sugar is always much lower than someone with a blunted first phase insulin response instead. So that's kind of like the first phase insulin response. Then you have the second phase insulin response, and that's ultimately where, as the blood sugar levels rise up, you'll get a movement of sugar from the bloodstream into the pancreas. So you have these things called glucose transporters. And you'll have different types of glucose transporters, and some of them will just sit in the surface of the cell, and that allows the glucose then just to move into that cell essentially. So on the pancreas, you have what are called glucose transporter 2, and they are a one-way kind of pathway in a sense, if you think of it like that. So as the gradient increases, as the blood sugar levels increase, this allows the sugar to enter into the pancreas. And once it enters into the pancreas, the cells within there start to make more ATP. More ATP through a whole bunch of different mechanisms eventually leads to the production of insulin and the release of insulin. So your second phase insulin response is in response to blood sugar levels going up gradually in the body. So you have this first phase, which is when the food enters the gut, and then the second phase is when the blood sugar levels actually start to increase a little bit.
Okay. That does make sense. That does make sense. No, that's brilliant. Now, tell me if I'm jumping the gun and there are other things you want to kind of cover beforehand. But I guess the question coming to mind is, what are the sorts of things, or do we know what sorts of things can influence these two phases? Or certainly phase 1 when we talk about GLP-1.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I mean, if you look at GLP-1, like you can, in a certain populations of people, and this will definitely come, those people that experience like hypoglycemic sort of symptoms, whereas if they crash after a meal within like 1 or 2 hours after a meal, those people can often have an increased first phase insulin response. So they actually produce a lot of glucagon-like peptide 1, which results in a really big dump of insulin into the system. Now, with those people, the first question is always whether there's any increased gastric emptying. Do they have loose stools? Because that might cause there to be a big flood of like saccharides into the digestive system that then stimulates a much higher level of glucagon-like peptide 1. So that's kind of one possibility for sure. You will get to some degree, like bitters will actually stimulate glucagon-like peptide 1. So if you look at like berberine, for example, is a very common one that people will use to help with blood sugar regulation. And one of its functions is to actually stimulate glucagon-like peptide 1. So if you're, if you've got the certain type of individual that you think might benefit from stimulation of glucagon, like that first phase insulin response, then berberine before a meal might be quite useful. Now, what I've kind of thought with berberine as well is because berberine is used a lot of the time for, as an antimicrobial, essentially. Right. And in some cases, probably quite high levels of berberine are used for like, SIBO and that sort of thing. And the people that you have to be super careful with berberine supplementation as an antimicrobial is always going to be those people that have a tendency towards hypoglycemic symptoms, because actually what you might do is you might push them into a more hypoglycemic state by stimulating glucagon-like peptide 1 too much, which is a really just an interesting thing that I was sort of going, well, it's no wonder that there's a population of people that really have a negative response to berberine as a supplement when used as an antimicrobial. So I just found that separately as a sort of fascinating area, I guess.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and it certainly starts to explain that, because I would completely agree that there's this subset of people that just really don't get on with berberine as an antimicrobial. So that's a real nice kind of nuggets of wisdom for us practitioners to be mindful of.
Yeah, because it's like, well, is it a die-off, or actually is this kind of symptom of like cognitive impairment? Is it actually low blood sugar? Are you pushing into a hypoglycemic state from that, which then actually in some people is going to result in kind of counter-regulatory hormones like cortisol and adrenaline having to be increased. So in those people, you might even have some, there's a subset of people that have what's called beta adrenergic sensitivity. So as levels of cortisol and adrenaline increase, those people are much more sensitive to increases in cortisol and adrenaline and experience these higher symptoms. So I guess this probably brings us quite nicely onto like the subject of hypoglycemia or reactive hypoglycemia and what's actually causing that, because I think the standard sort of explanation has always been, it's because your blood sugar levels are low. And actually, when you look at, there's quite a lot of research in this now where they're trying to induce a hypoglycemic state, and a lot of the time it's not actually low blood sugar, but it's the response of the counter-regulatory hormones that causes the hypoglycemic symptoms that people think that they're getting. So it's not actually hypoglycemic symptoms, it's more a reaction to the elevations in some of the stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, because they're counteracting the fact that they don't want the blood sugar levels to drop. So it's a stress response in this, essentially. And as they go up, that actually creates a lot of the symptoms of things like irritability or feeling hangry, like feeling a bit jittery, like those types of symptoms instead. So you'll get that kind of subset of people that will have more of a tendency towards reactive hypoglycemic symptoms, shall we say. We'll call it that, rather than reactive hypoglycemia, because it might not be reactive hypoglycemia. Some people will get reactive hypoglycemia. So, sure. But that tends, that tends to only happen a lot of the time with people that are doing like a glucose challenge test. So in a very extreme situation of, drinking a whole ton of like glucose essentially, and then having your blood sugar shoot up and then having it crash back down again. And then oftentimes that will bring the levels down to a level that, to be honest, if they're having a normal meal, it would never really reach that point instead. So, yeah, in my experience and from a lot of the research that I've seen, a lot of the symptoms that are more to do with reactive hypoglycemia are actually to do with increases in cortisol, adrenaline at certain points when the blood sugar levels start to drop down. But it's actually the response to those hormones rather than the sugar levels getting too low.
That's really interesting. And I think taking that sort of broader perspective of it, that's a really important thing to consider. I mean, a real common theme that's come up in all of the podcast episodes so far has been this idea of just trying to basically reduce allostatic load, or reduce the stress and the strain and the wear and tear on people's physiology to help them recover or improve their health. And if in a subset of people they're getting this reactive hypoglycemia symptomatology, but actually it's essentially partly a stress response, then I guess in some ways, some of our recommendations that we've been using is still 100% valid, but the reasoning behind it is just very different. Is
Yeah,
that right?
exactly. That's the thing with it. To be honest with you, with a lot of the blood sugar stuff, the recommendations are right. It's just that the mechanism of why we're making those recommendations are a little bit different. And sometimes in that subset population that are sensitive to those elevations in sort of stress hormones, you then have to maybe consider other aspects of nutrition and lifestyle as well. Like, I mean, most importantly, with that section of people that do get these kind of postprandial, like whether we call it hypoglycemic reaction or increased stress response reaction, with those people, that meal that precedes that reaction is probably the most important thing to think about. Is what is the balance of macronutrients in that meal, and is it appropriate for you? Like if you've got this very, very high carbohydrate diet with very little fats, fibers, or proteins in there, you are going to have much more of a stimulation of your glucagon-like peptide 1 as a result of having a meal that is this sort of more refined sort of processed carbohydrate without those other kind of macronutrients and fibers in there to slow the rate at which that food is broken down, goes through the digestive system, and is absorbed into the digestive system. So it doesn't change what we're doing. I guess it's just kind of understanding the mechanisms of why it might be occurring more than anything. You will have those kind of, rather than the postprandial, you'll have some people that will get this, I guess, low blood sugar symptoms after a long fast. And that is slightly different in the sense that, with those people is there an issue with, from a mitochondrial point of view and an energy production point of view, are they able to metabolize fats as well as what they should be able to? Are they able to sustain a fast correctly and still feel and function perfectly fine? And I think, in this, there's been a bit of a movement in recent years towards fasting, which I have no issue with that at all. But I think it's about selecting when fasting is right for someone. And I think it's also about the ability to not jump from one way of eating suddenly into something that is completely different, because to a degree we have to train the body to actually be able to cope with doing a longer fast, if that makes sense. So, if someone's predominantly, reliant upon carbohydrates, and then we decide to put them and do a 24-hour fast, they're probably going to feel like crap through that. And they might have a lot of like sort of lower blood sugar symptoms and a lot of that, what would be termed as keto flu, as a result of going into fasting or going straight into more of a low carb ketogenic diet. So sometimes there is a transition that we have to go through with certain populations if they're looking to, be able to fast out a little bit longer and not experience some of those, whether it's hypoglycemic symptoms or whether it's kind of an inability to maintain glucose or produce ketones. Like they're kind of, that's just an interesting sort of separate area, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's again a really important point to make, because I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying there are studies out there looking at fasting and HRV, so heart rate variability, and some of it just indicates that fasting is not optimal for some people. Now that might be based on their current state of health and physiology, but I do think it's one of these things that's become very trendy, and actually are some of the people applying these intermittent fasting type techniques not really doing themselves any value or getting the benefit that they would be expecting to get.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it is a really key point there. Okay, that's really interesting. I think it's really important and useful, because obviously I just feel there's a lot of outdated, let's say, mechanistic understanding then in regards to all of this, because we'll probably move on in a little bit, if not now, to kind of insulin, blood sugar from a metabolic syndrome, obesity sort of perspective.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see how what we've discussed kind of ties in with that as well, because obviously there's this classic understanding of high carb diets increasing insulin production, insulin storing sugar as fat, and therefore we should be avoiding our carbohydrates. But I get the feeling it's not that simple.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it like, I think there's a simplicity to the development of metabolic syndrome. And I think if you look at Professor Roy Taylor, who's based in Newcastle, and he's got like his twin cycle hypothesis, which is essentially we eat too much food or we're out of energy balance. Fat accumulates on the liver, eventually fat accumulates on the pancreas. As a result, once the fat starts accumulating on the liver and in muscle cells, our insulin sensitivity reduces down. We can't get those sugars away. Eventually, fat accumulates on the pancreas, and therefore the pancreas stops to be able to function properly. We can't produce insulin as we should do normally, and then blood sugar levels start to go out of control. Ultimately, from that very basic mechanistic point of view, is you need to lose body fat. And that's kind of, when you're looking at like metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, if as much as there are complexities behind it, a lot of what goes on behind it is you need to lose body fat, and the chances are you need to have a look at energy balance. Well, you definitely have to look at energy balance. Now, what factors might be influencing energy balance? That's another kind of interesting area, because I'm sure if you're like me, you'll have some people that come in and, they're on these kind of strict 1,200 calorie a day diets, and they're either lying and wasting money with you, or they are just not metabolizing or making energy as effectively as what they should be able to. So there has to be underlying mechanisms going on in the background that are actually causing that energy balance to be skewed in a sense. So it's still an energy balance issue, but there are things influencing that energy balance. I'll come on to that in a bit, but I think the fundamentals, I think when you're looking at type 2 diabetes with the majority of the population is, energy balance issues, fat accumulation. Over time, that starts to affect the hormones that essentially manage blood sugar levels. They go out of control. You need to drop body fat. I know certainly when I first started learning about sort of insulin resistance, it was very much a blood sugar levels go up, and then as blood sugar levels go up, insulin gets released. Insulin latches onto the receptor, and we're talking about kind of skeletal muscle now. And within the skeletal muscle, because it's going to be a dumping ground for a lot of glucose, the GLUT4 vesicles, so these are those kind of glucose transporters, are then able to go to the surface of the cell and bring the glucose in. So the main theory that people kind of work with, I think, with metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance is impaired clearance. And that's kind of where most people will go towards. It's an insulin resistance issue. You're not clearing sugar from the blood and bringing it out and putting it into cells as effectively as what you should do. I think there can probably be a counter argument to that, in the sense that, is it a production issue as well? In that if your insulin is unable to latch onto the insulin receptor that then suppresses glucagon, then if glucagon remains high as well, then we have this continuous release of glucose into the blood at the same time as which we've actually got sugar levels that are too high already. So you could have maybe a little bit of both. You could have too much production, but you could also have poor clearance as well at the same time. So I think to put all of our eggs into one basket and assume that it's just about clearance is probably incorrect. And maybe production is a big part of it as well. The other kind of really interesting thing with this, I think, is from a clearance perspective, is are our muscle cells actually creating insulin resistance on purpose? And that is a really kind of a slightly more kind of deeper evolutionary sort of argument, and also a physiological argument as well, in the sense of when we have an infection or when we're ill, your body will become temporarily more insulin resistant to ensure that the sugars are available to deliver to like white blood cells so that they're able to do what they need to do. So we're actually better able to fight off infection at that time. And there's been links kind of shown with increased lipopolysaccharide causing more inflammation and increased insulin resistance at that time. So is it the inflammation that's affecting the cell, or are we mechanistically making ourselves more insulin resistant so we're better able to cope with infections as they're taking place as well? So I think we have to look at those kind of underlying mechanisms at which, if for example, we are trying to force sugar into the blood, like glucose, into the cells, when actually the body is trying to fight off an infection or trying to deal with like a chronic LPS exposure or something like that. Are we actually making our body less effective at dealing with, say, an infection of some kind, like that sort of thing? So that for me is a really interesting area, is that there's mechanisms at which we will create insulin resistance for the benefit of the body. And I think they're always interesting questions to ask, is if the body is doing something naturally, why is it doing it, and why should we override it, and what are the consequences if we do override it? Because ultimately, if we've got this kind of cell that is already, and this is a slightly separate areas, if our cells are already full of glycogen and we don't need more glycogen to go into it, and then we give someone more insulin to force that glucose into the cell, the issue with that is that what you're going to end up doing is, because we can't store more glycogen, we don't need to make more energy out of it. So ultimately, it's going to go through the pathways that eventually lead to more fat accumulation, which then within the muscle tissue cell, which then makes it even more insulin resistant, which then compounds the issue. So we end up with insulin resistance being treated with insulin sensitizing agents or insulin itself, but it's actually making the whole situation worse. And this is where you want to come back to the basic, what do we actually need to do to help this? And the fundamentals are, we need much less energy coming in, or we need to find a way for our body to use more energy. So movement and looking at diet are always going to be the two most important things here. If we just let someone carry on doing what they're doing, but give them more insulin and give them things like metformin, and it's not just medications, it's like from a natural healthcare setting, if we're giving people things like bitter melon, if we're giving people banana leaf, if we're giving people things that act like insulin or increase insulin sensitivity, we're doing exactly the same thing. And actually what we're doing is potentially compounding an issue of fat accumulation within the cells, which then leads to more and more insulin resistance, and the cycle just continues.
Yeah, that's very well explained. And I think the beauty of it is, I think what you've said there is kind of a true example of I will use the term kind of functional medicine, in the sense that it's understanding the mechanisms, it's good science ultimately, but it's asking and answering effectively the why. Why is the body doing this? Because I had this conversation with Robin earlier, so the podcast would have been released by now, but we were kind of having a conversation around autoimmunity, and she was saying how a lot of these genetic predispositions don't predispose you to an autoimmune condition as such, but they influence the way your immune system responds to a trigger, an infection, a heavy metal, etc.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that the body's got an innate ability to rehabilitate, regenerate, and naturally we want to be supporting those processes rather than just managing the symptoms, which I think sometimes we get guilty of even in the complementary healthcare sector, as you say. Yeah. One thing I just want to clarify, I guess, for some of the listeners, you mentioned this kind of LPS lipopolysaccharide molecule, and that is a breakdown product of certain bacteria in the gut. It's got a lot of research behind it from a leaky gut perspective. So I assume, Steve, we're right in saying that leaky gut, because of the LPS traveling across the gut barrier, if that is chronic, can contribute and start dysregulating some of these mechanisms as well.
Yeah, that's what seems to be the case. I mean, a lot of the research at the moment is kind of looking at injecting LPS into people and seeing mechanisms at which that occurs. But if we extrapolate that to kind of chronic LPS exposure as a result of intestinal permeability, bacterial overgrowth, like gram-negative bacterial overgrowth, then yeah, I think I think that's where you kind of look at someone and you go, you're coming into me with type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes or whatever it is, but you also have these gut symptoms, and we have this picture of insulin resistance. And what we don't want to do is ignore what's going on in the gut, because actually that might be a really significant part of the picture or part of the puzzle in terms of us addressing what's going on with your, blood sugar dysregulation.
Yeah, 100%. No, I think that's it's really important. Again, that's appreciating the interconnectedness of all of these systems, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. I think definitely for sure.
Excellent. I know you wanted, I'm not sure if you've now partly done this or not, but going back to what you mentioned around energy balance being skewed. So someone, let's say, on a restrictive 1200 calorie a day diet, and as you say, kind of, I guess the two options are they're misreporting their food intake or calorie intake, or there is something going on mechanistically.
Yeah.
Are we able to expand on? I mean, feel free if you can to use any kind of case studies here, maybe, or just some of the mechanisms that might be at play in that kind of situation. Because I would agree, I see a lot of people come to me who promise me, and I do believe them, that they are not lying. You know, they give me their food diary, they show me pictures of their meals, and unless they were lying, there's something else going on there. And I'm very mindful that there seems to be this huge divide, I think, in the industry of people, and I've seen it in social media at least, whereby coaches will saying they are lying to you. That is the only option in this kind of scenario. And I've always refused to believe that that's the case, because sometimes these people are really suffering.
Yeah.
And there's got to be something else going on because they're putting everything into getting better. So can you expand on, some of the things that we want to be mindful of there?